Alright, so we all know that sports is about capturing fast action, but what happens when we have less light? We gotta turn that shutter speed down, and it gets a little bit dicey. Well, that's where the night vision settings come in. Just kidding, there's no night vision settings. Wish there were, because sometimes it feels like I need night vision goggles in some of the venues I shoot in. But these couple tips have really helped me out. Hopefully they'll help you out. And let's get started with a pro tip before we get to the basic settings. Something that took me a little bit of time to figure out and use. Hopefully it helps you. Pro tip, so when shooting night games or inside gyms, the lights aren't necessarily going to light the playing surface evenly. So as you can see here in this photo, these are actually even temporary stadium lights, and there's just bands of light across the field. So this makes it very difficult to take photos because sometimes the player is really bright, sometimes they're really dark. And this is something you need to get used to. It's not always this dramatic. This is probably the worst case I've seen. So I had to take a picture so I could show you. If you're shooting basketball or football or soccer, something like that at night, the field is not going to be evenly lit. And that's just because of where they place the lights. So unless you're in an NBA arena, there's generally a wall back here. And so there's not going to really be any light coming onto the court from this direction. And when we're shooting basketball or anything inside, we're typically sitting down here shooting this way, and the athletes are coming towards us, which means they're going to be darker when they're coming at us. So if you're taking exposure for a player who's here in the center of the court, and once they get to you down here by the basket, they're going to be a lot darker. So it's something that you need to figure out during warm-ups. What does your exposure need to be to get a good exposure of players in this area? But it's something that you need to know is that the exposures are going to be different depending on if you're here at midcourt or under the basket. Generally, the best light is sort of in the center court, which not as much action happens, so it's not that helpful. But that's just because you're getting light from all directions, whereas down here you're only really getting light maybe from the side, maybe a little bit in front of them, but generally behind them. Now a similar thing when you're shooting outside, if you're shooting football, right, you get stadium lights around here, so you're getting these, light spill here. And you can see where both lights are pointing this way. You're going to have more light maybe in certain areas than other areas. So it's not going to be as good here in the end zones, which unfortunate, that's where the scoring happens. People celebrate. But it's something to know. If you're shooting here and the play moves this way and you're trying to get around, you got to remember if you're in manual mode to change your settings to take into account this darker area. Again, this is something that you can figure out if you get there early during warm-ups, something like that, to figure out, okay, is it darker in certain places? Am I gonna get better images in different areas? Like this soccer example, if you're just a parent with a small camera, short lens, stand right by the light and know that that action that's gonna happen in front of you will be well lit. You don't have to worry as much about it being too dark because you're looking at the most well lit part of the field and you're just waiting for that action to come to you. So the big dilemma when shooting in low light situations is that you want to have a high enough shutter speed that you're not getting too much motion blur in your image, and that you're not shooting at too high of an ISO where you're getting a ton of noise and grain into your image and it just doesn't look right. So we want to find this nice balance. Typically I'll start at 1/1000th and 1600 ISO just to see where I am. If it's too dark, is it too bright? And if it's good, great. I can kind of stay there. Maybe if I'm shooting at this and I'm shooting a high level sport, I actually will probably increase my shutter speed to maybe 1/2000th of a second. If I double that, it means I have to double my ISO to keep the image bright enough, to keep the exposure correct. All right, and I'm still not going to get too much noise. Now, honestly, with these newer cameras, you can shoot at really high ISOs and still be able to get a usable image, especially if you're posting on Instagram or something like that. It's going to be such a small photo that all that noise and stuff isn't going to be entirely visible. Now, if it's really dark, you're in a dungeon, you might have to go to 1/500th of a second, going all the way up to 6400, something like that. And just know that if you're shooting high school, that's probably good enough. If it's, you're trying to whip your camera around, you'll probably end up getting some motion blur. But if that's what you have to do to get a properly exposed image, to keep it sharp, that's what you have to do. When I'm shooting in low light situations, typically that means it's a night game or inside of a venue, and that means that the light generally does not change. So I will shoot on manual because I can just dial in my settings and just don't have to worry about it after that. Now, I know I said earlier sometimes the light can vary on a field or inside depending on where you are, but if I'm shooting basketball, I know I'm going to be under the basket for most of the game. I set it on manual, I get my exposure. It's not really going to change unless I change positions, and then I'll just reset the camera. Now, if I'm outside, if it's something really dramatic, I'll put it on aperture priority. So I suggest just setting it on manual, getting used to it, because in the long run, it's going to be way more useful than just playing around with the auto modes. All right, so it's finally time for the settings. Now, grab your camera, take off your lens cap, turn it on, go to manual mode. And if you have no idea where to start, I suggest just go to 1/1000th of a second, dial your f-stop all the way down. This is only f4. And just go to 1600 ISO. It'll probably be dark if you're inside, but you can take a picture. Yep, looks pretty dark. So I'll increase my ISO, go to 6400 or so, and take another picture, and looks much better. Now, you can also use this little guy right here. So as you change it, oh, yeah, that's gonna be a little dark, and it's telling me that. So if I can get that right in the center, I'm going to have a decent exposure. That's what the camera is automatically going to do if you have it on auto mode. It's going to try to hit it right in the center. Now, also when you're checking your settings, make sure that you're pointing out at the floor or a subject that you're going to shoot on the field. Because if you're just like looking down and you're taking this, then you're getting an exposure for the floor, or the ceiling, or a wall. That's not the exposure you want. So make sure you're pointing forward in the direction that you're going to be shooting during the game. If you watch my other video on taking sharper images, you know that I suggest not going below 1/1000th of a second, and inside I said 1/500th. And in general, I try not to go under 1/1000th, even inside, unless it's high school or lower and it's just incredibly dark. Then I'll drop down to a 500th or somewhere in between that and 1000. But once you get up to that really, really dark situations, it really is a judgment call. If you're there during warm-ups, again, warm-ups is a great time to just get dialed in. And you can practice, okay, is 1/500th going to be best, or am I going to have to go up to 10,000 ISO and check out what your image looks like? It's really a judgment call once you get to that really dark venue. Now, the age-old question, RAW versus JPEG. Now, in shooting sports, I shoot JPEG 90% of the time. But when it gets really dark, or there's just colors that I have to worry about, lights flickering in the stadium, I will shoot RAW, because it just has a lot better editing capability after the fact, where if the colors are way off because the lights are flickering oddly, I have more room to edit a RAW photo in Lightroom after the fact. And it also helps just with exposure. You have a little bit more room to play with as well. Now, I know some people choose to shoot JPEG and then do noise reduction in the camera, but I just prefer to do the noise reduction after the fact on the RAW photo. Two common things that I see when people are shooting in low light are using a flash. All right, there we go. And using image stabilization. Now, first of all, flash. Please don't use an on-camera flash or the one that pops up from your camera. If it's really dark in a venue, I know sometimes it automatically comes up. You gotta figure out how to turn that setting off, because it can be very distracting to players. And unless you get specific permission from the teams or the coaches, whoever you need, then you can try it. But if you're not that familiar with flash, you can just be very distracting to players. Now, flash is possible. You can use it in certain venues, but they're typically more expensive and a lot bigger than just an on-camera flash. You're not just like having it on your camera and blasting someone in the face. Most of the NBA photographers that are shooting for the teams have flashes up in the stands, up in the rafters, and they're just up there all the time, but they're very powerful. They actually flash really, really quick so that you really can't even perceive it a lot of times with your eye unless you're really looking for it. So these flashes typically aren't going to flash in people's faces. They're kind of either from right behind them or off to the side, not in their general view. So please don't just go there and be like, oh, I'm just going to use my flash and just blast away. Probably not going to work. Also, the sync speed is like 1/200th of a second. So you still are probably going to get motion blur and you're still not going to get a great photo. So don't worry about the flash. Don't use it. Next thing is image stabilization. Now, you can turn it on. Probably not going to help you though, because it's really for camera shake, not for stopping a subject that's moving. The lens isn't going to be able to calculate what's going on there and move itself to follow along. So really, unless you're trying to do a slow shutter pan, something like that, shutter drag, that's when you can use image stabilization, because it'll help if you're, not staying straight. It'll try to keep it level for you as you're following a subject. But in general, it's not going to stop a subject when it's on. So image stabilization, if you're shooting over like 1/250th of a second, something like that, which you should be, you don't really need to use it. As always, I hope these tips were extremely helpful for you and you're getting a ton out of these videos. So if I missed anything, let me know in the comments. Always looking to improve my images. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Always happy to answer. See you next time.